Hey, what's up, U.S. History World? This is Mr. Norris,
And Mr. Lawrence.
and we're going to talk to you about key constitutional compromises. These are topics that appear quite often on the New York State Regents exam, especially the multiple choice section. So let's get going. All right, when we're talking about the first couple compromises here, every single one of these is going to revolve around the issue of representation. When we're talking about representation, what are we talking about, Mr. Lawrence?
We're talking about how many delegates will be sent to our new national legislature that's created after the Constitutional Convention.
So one thing we know from the problems with the Articles of Confederation was that each state had the same amount of representatives. So whether they were a large state or a small state, they all had the equal number of votes. So when the delegates go to the Constitutional Convention, they're trying to fix that. So we have the Virginia Plan, which is also known as the Large State Plan. Do be able to identify it by both names, and it was proposed by this guy, James Madison, who happened to be the shortest president in history. Did you know that?
I did not.
He was 5 feet 4 inches tall. So let's talk about the Virginia plan. James Madison proposed a bicameral legislature, and you see this underlined, italicized, and bolded because it is that important of a term to know. If you look at it, all it means is a two-house legislature. You see bicameral meaning two houses. And he proposed that representation in both of these houses would be based on population. Now, Virginia had the largest population, so they favored it. And other large states would favor this as well because they would have more representation in Congress. But how might the small states feel about this?
Well, the small states, they're going to be a little upset because more representation meant more power. More power meant that you controlled and really set the tone for the government. So the small states will interject their idea and they come up with what's referred to as the New Jersey Plan, or sometimes the Small State Plan. And it was proposed a legislature that would have equal representation for each state. So trying to make it more democratic. So Virginia would, let's say, have four. New York would have four. Rhode Island, Connecticut all have four. And again, the goal was to try and have an equal, fair playing ground so that small states could also have a say within the new government that was going to be created.
So we have two competing ideas here, and what normally do people do when they have differences of opinion? What do they try to do?
Well, hopefully they try to work out their differences of opinion and come up with a compromise. And that's really what we hope our politicians do in order to keep the government moving forward.
Can you identify a great compromiser in U.S. history?
Would Henry Clay be considered a
I
great compromiser?
I think he absolutely would be, but we'll get to him later. All right, so we're going to talk about the Great Compromise, which is also known as the Connecticut Compromise, and it was introduced by this guy, Roger Sherman, and I think the picture says it all. So he proposes a bicameral legislature. What does bicameral mean again?
Bicameral, very important term, knowing that it's a legislative body made up of two houses. So, for example, we have a Senate and a House of Representatives.
Now, the House of Representatives under the Great Compromise, this portion of Congress is based on representation. So this favors large states because states with larger population would be able to have more representatives. So how are we going to appease or make the small states happy here?
Well, the second part was the creation of what was considered an upper house, which would be a Senate, and each state would have two senators, so giving equal representation within that house. Again, favored by small states because it promoted more equity within this new legislative body.
So we still need to figure out though, how is representation determined? What happens every 10 years?
So actually, according to the Constitution, it's a delegated power is that the federal government has to have a census. Every 10 years, we have a census in order to count the population. So it's very important that you take the time and fill out your census because it helps to determine how much power and representation you as a community have within our federal system.
I'm glad you mentioned that word delegated. Again, a delegated power is a power that is given only to the federal government. So it's not New York State that does a census or individual states, it is the federal government. And if you take a moment and look at the Virginia plan, New Jersey plan here, you'll see that the similarities between the two and differences as well. All right, we're going to move on to another compromise that deals with representation, and this is called the Three-Fifths Compromise. So the issue here is now that they've determined that the House would be based on population, the question is, would slaves count towards representation in Congress, and if so, how? So, Mr. Lawrence, please tell us about the northern view.
Well, within this debate comes two views, the northern view and the southern view. And the northern view, they felt that Slaves should not count towards population. Northerners were kind of believing and moving away from this institution of slavery and really were afraid of slaves counting towards population because then it would give southern states a stronger stake within this new federal government.
And a concern is that if slaves counted towards population and the southern states became more powerful, they could pass more and more laws that would, in fact, protect slavery. So let's go on to the southern view.
So the southern view is pretty much the opposite. They wanted slaves to count towards population. They felt that it was part of their southern culture and ultimately should count towards this new federal system and the House of Representatives.
So the two sides hammer out another deal based on representation, and this compromise says that 3 out of 5 slaves would count towards population for representation in the House. So if there are 100 slaves in the state of Virginia, 60 of them would count towards population for the House of Representatives.
So the issue of slavery once again comes up within the Constitutional Convention, and there are strong divisions within founders on their view of slavery. Should slavery be outlawed immediately? Should it die out over time? Should it continue indefinitely? So again, founders came up with one more compromise, and it was a slave trade compromise. And what was the issue was really determining how long would the international slave trade continue into the new American nation.
So what we see here is that for the next 20 years, and in 1808, the international slave trade would end. So if you think back to colonial America, and we talk about the triangular trade, and especially this passage going from Africa to the Americas, this bottom leg here, that's called the Middle Passage. This will be outlawed, at least for the United States, in 1808. So we really see this Middle Passage triangular trade start to end during this time. So in 1808, it no longer is legal. Can you still buy and sell slaves though, Mr. Lawrence?
Unfortunately, yes, slavery does not end in 1808. Some founders felt by putting in this compromise, slavery would just slowly die out. But what we'll continue to talk about in the course is that, unfortunately, slavery didn't. It continued, and it really won't come to a complete end until the end of the Civil War.
Okay, let's talk about the Bill of Rights. And you may be asking yourself, the Bill of Rights, is this a compromise? And the answer is a resounding yes. And let's lay the framework here. We have two groups that are going to develop when we talk about the Constitution and whether or not it should be approved. The first group is Federalist. And if you look at the word Federalist, you will see the word federal in it. So think a federal government. And the Federalists are going to advocate or favor the ratification, which is a fancy way of saying approval, of the Constitution. So if Federalists favor the Constitution, who might be against the Constitution? What could we call them?
Well, those are going to be our anti-federalists. So if you put the phrase anti in front of something, it usually means against, right? So they were fearful of a strong central government. Again, these were founders who had this fear of a strong monarch, of a strong central government that would dominate individual lives, and wanted to really focus on limited government. So again, these 10 amendments were a compromise in order to ratify or pass or approve the Constitution. So Mr. Norris, really quickly, what is an amendment? When I use that word amendment, what does an amendment mean?
Great question. An amendment means that you are changing something, and the Constitution has been changed 27 times in U.S. history.
The Bill of Rights were added again to gain more support from the anti-federalists, to go to the anti-federalists and say, hey, we understand your fear, your skepticism of strong central government. We fought a revolution against a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, but a monarchy nonetheless, and we want to make sure that those individual rights we believe in are enshrined within the Constitution. So we'll make those 10 changes, and we'll specifically outline what are some rights we have as an American.
And this is the final blow to the Articles of Confederation, which ceases to exist. Okay, let's talk about some tips for your exam, some multiple choice questions, what you might need to know. First and foremost, as we started out when this video began, both the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise dealt with the issue of representation, particularly representation in Congress.
Again, understanding that Federalists, they favored the Constitution. Anti-Federalists were very wary of a strong central government. So very important to keep in mind this debate, because this debate will continue through much of American history, if not to today, the role of government in our daily lives.
And also be able to recognize the word bicameral and understand that it means a two-house legislature, and we see that today as Congress. All right, that is it for us. Hopefully we cleared up some constitutional compromises for you. Please take a moment and subscribe to our channel if you have not already. Help spread the word, and good luck on all your tests.